Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of From Theory to Practice. This time, we are talking about the question, what's difficult about problem detection? Now, our panel today, I'm going to let us introduce ourselves here. We're going to start with Joanna. Go ahead.
Hi, Matt. Thank you for having me here. My name is Joanna Mazgaj. I'm a director of production engineering team at Tala. We're a fintech company. And what my team does is we own incident management process, right? All kinds of production escalation, not excluding obviously anything that's not a P0 production incident, but a wide variety of those. And we also own tools, and we build tools that allows some of our internal teams to manage some of those escalations. So yeah, I've been doing that for a couple years. Switched a few roles since I joined Tala. Primarily started in a QA capacity, but moved into operational role about a year and a half, 2 years ago.
Awesome. Welcome.
Thank you.
Kurt?
And I'm Kurt Andersen. I'm SRE architect with Blameless and kind of co-host or honorary co-host here of this series with Matt, and try to work on making our product do what our customers need it to do. So I'll pass it on to Laura.
Hi, I'm Nolan. I am a principal engineer at a very new startup called Stanza Systems. Our mission is to build products to make it easier to run your production systems. Prior to that, I was at Slack. A lot of people know me for several public post-mortem incident write-ups that I've done there. Before that, I was an SRE at Google, where I worked on a number of various things. I'm very interested in sort of how humans work with systems and how that impacts our system's reliability.
Great, thank you. Welcome. My name is Matt Davis. I am an SRE advocate at Blameless. And what I do there is an amalgamation of engineering in the infra and SRE team. So I do a lot of observability, subject matter expert stuff, and a lot of applied resilience engineering, including our weekly practice of practice session, which inspired this webinar series. Now, today we're going to be talking about problem detection. This is something I've been thinking about extremely recently because I was on incident command on call last week, just came off call yesterday. And I'll be honest, we had a couple of incidents where problem detection was a problem. You know, we weren't detecting the right problems, we were detecting the wrong problems, and we didn't know which problem was which. It was actually very confusing, and it made the incident last a pretty long time. I'll ask Laura, I'll ask you first. Have you had incidents like this where problem detection specifically caused the incident to go longer or confused troubleshooting efforts with the responders? Has that ever happened?
Oh gosh, yes. I think that's definitely the case. I've seen this, I guess, both with, very, very significant kind of acute incidents, like, where major parts of your systems are down. And I've also seen it with sort of gray failures, where you have some sort of an intermittent or sporadic failure that crops up. And in both cases, it can be quite, I guess in the first case, you have some problem, but figuring out what the problem is can be difficult. And I think part of the nature of that is just that, systems are complex, and, something fails and you get knock-on effects in a bunch of other places, and it becomes very, very difficult to say, what's the cause and what's the effect, because in a sense, both are both, right?
Yeah.
So, yes.
How
Many of the time, you have a problem, but you don't know what it is.
Yeah. How about you, Joanna? Has problem detection become a problem for resolving incidents in your org?
I kind of want to say, of course, never. um, but I also sympathize with Laura saying, oh, gosh, yes. So the answer is gosh, yes. It has happened a number of times, and it was really painful at a time, because you sort of want to dive in, you want to fix what's going on to, be back in operations, business as usual. And then you're running into those issues of like, I don't have the information that I need to fix it, right? I don't have the tools that I need to find out what's going on, to debug it. And sometimes, like you said at the beginning, it take hours, right? And I've had war rooms that took hours unnecessarily, because problem detection was a significant issue. So
Kurt, I'll ask you the same question.
Definitely. And particularly in the area of problems that occur related to machine learning frameworks and areas, because often what will happen, and this is a bit of a characteristic in machine learning systems, is that they'll train on a given data set, and then the world drifts. And if the data set training is not updated periodically, you get this deviation between the real world and what the model thinks the world should be doing. This can tend to grow really fast, as was seen at the beginning of the COVID pandemic, when all of the models that told Uber how many Uber Eats needed to be delivered failed dramatically, because, hey, everybody's just radically changed their behavior. Or it can be a very slow drift and take months before it gets to the point of, is this really a problem? Is this something that's going on? Why are we seeing these kinds of discrepancies? So it can be a very subtle thing, and that's where problem detection becomes very challenging, on finding these drift sort of problems.
I think it's really, go ahead.
So, sorry, for anyone watching this, I'm in a different continent, so I've got high latency, so I'm not being super rude by speaking over people. Kurt, I was just going to say, I think what you've identified there is actually a specific variation of the problem of how do you detect correctness or not. And when your system is the source of truth, or it's supposed to be the source of truth, how do you sort of double check that? And I mean, in some cases there are ways, but that's a challenge, and not only for machine learning systems.
Yeah, agreed.
This reminds me of similar effects in ad tech, because in ad tech, working with big data, you actually, it's a guessing game in a lot of ways, because you're not working with the whole data set. You're always working with a portion of the data set, a sample of the data set, and those samples do not behave the same way that 40 terabytes of data behave. And I remember we ran into that a lot. Different things would happen in the system in response to real world events that the data engineers just really didn't account for, or they underestimated something, or they may have even overestimated something. And we ran into that a lot. So it became this crazy guessing game of I guess almost a game of horseshoes. You know how they say, close doesn't count in horseshoes? And it felt like that. It's like, well, we didn't get the horseshoe on, but we got it real close, but close isn't good enough. And that kind of situation happened. I'm particularly interested in the correctness that Laura mentioned. Is this the right problem? And I'll give an example. The incident that I alluded to earlier, just off the top of my head, thinking about the timeline, and I wrote the analysis, so it's very fresh. I can pinpoint at least 4 different mitigations, and not just problem detection here. We detected 4 different problems, and we detected that we needed to mitigate the problems. So they actually were problems. Let me state that. But they weren't the right problem. It wasn't the correct problem. And it took us actually several hours to get to the correct problem. Go ahead.
So what you're saying is you had a problem, but in the process of figuring out what the problem was, you ran into 4 other ones. Like, you can call them extras, right? That you can now mitigate to maybe avoid them happening or blowing out of proportion. So I don't know if it's a good thing or a bad thing, right? Because you were looking for one problem, you found 5, but the only one problem was giving you, you know, issues at the time. And when I say issues, I mean operational issues, right?
Yeah.
Big enough to warrant actually having, you know, a war room, an investigation, right?
Right. And that's an excellent point, because these problems were not, Laura mentioned earlier about how problems like in a pinball machine, they kind of bounce off each other and kind of cause each other to happen or influence each other. In this case, none of these problems were influential to each other. So you're exactly right, Joanna. We actually did find problems that needed to be repaired, but they weren't affecting the actual outage that was happening. We did create some follow-up items for those problems that weren't connected to the incident. So it does happen.
That's a relatively common pattern, I think. I mean, you go digging into something because you're looking for the cause of something that's, or well, the contributing factors of something that's causing you an issue right now that's customer visible, right? And then you find a bunch of other stuff, because our systems are always a little bit broken all the time, and that's kind of normal, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
It also reminds me of the situation in medicine that if you were to go and have a comprehensive battery of lab tests and, let's say, a full body scan, they would find all kinds of things that are not quote unquote normal. Are they a problem is a very different question than is it normal?
Yeah, and I have a personal experience that's extremely relevant. I had some hearing problems, and I have been through several years now of trying to treat this, and I went in to get an MRI, and the MRI came back clean for my ear problem, but the comment on my MRI was something, and I don't remember the medical term, but extreme congestion of like the upper sinus. And I was thinking, when I saw this prognosis, I'm like, oh, weird. And you know, how is this affecting my tinnitus and my hyperacusis? And the doctors were like, well, it's not. It's not. You know, we could take an MRI of any human in the building right now, and they would probably have the same sinus problem that you do. And and I was like, okay, on the one hand, MRI clean, great. But another problem was detected, and we decided not to worry about it. So the opposite of this is, how would we know about these problems if we didn't see them when we were trying to attack another problem?
I think that, I mean, to a certain degree, that's where the concept of SLOs, not necessarily as practiced, but the concept of SLOs applies, because if an SLO is structured to correspond with customer unhappiness, and that's kind of, this is the golden standard, and the ideal is that the SLO goes into violation when the customer becomes unhappy, or maybe just before the customer becomes unhappy. You can essentially ignore all the other things, like the old style alert on CPU, alert on memory. That doesn't matter if the customer isn't being affected. So
Well,
it's
that
kind of an
depends.
observability thing. Laura?
It does depend. I think you're right in many cases. But one of the things is our systems can be so robust that they can operate really well with a bunch of problems. But you get to a point where you add one more thing, and now the system falls apart in a really bad way. because the sort of the robustness of your system has been allowing you to go on with these problems. But eventually you get to the end of your system's capacity to adapt, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes sometimes problems about system resources actually can be really, really important. I would also normally consider that sort of thing to be an anti-pattern to alert on, but last year I did put in some memory percentage utilization alerts. And the reason I did that was because I found, and luckily I found this in dev, I found that a system I was running, which was a quorum-based system with a leader, whenever there was a leader failover or change, the new leader would have a spike in memory usage while it synced state from the other replicas. And so if you ever got into a situation where your leader was running out of memory and killed, you could get into a cascading situation where the next one would get killed and the next one would get killed. So
Ouch.
in that situation, I thought it was prudent to put in a memory percentage utilization alert. But so I mean, you can find yourself in situations where if you ignore little things like that, you can kind of walk yourself into a really bad state. And that's the paradox, you know, when is something important, or when is it just like one of these little intermittent gray failures that you can ignore safely?
So this is the second time you've used the term gray failure, Laura. Can you explain a little bit what you mean by gray failure?
Yeah. So I think this is not necessarily a term that's super well defined with a formal definition, but the way I would use it is a gray failure is when something doesn't, you know, fail all the way. Your system is still running, but it's running in some way that's a little bit degraded. So, you know, maybe it's had to, you know, fail over to a backup disk, or maybe, you know, you're running with, you know, 4 instances instead of 5, you know, or, you know, very often it's, you know, you have some sort of increase in latency, or you have a bunch of your requests failing, and sometimes that's kind of popping up as a user visible thing, but sometimes it's not. Like, we tend to be pretty good with retries and other mechanisms at papering over this kind of stuff, but, you know, eventually it does pop up, and sometimes it really can cause a big issue.
And
So-
for folks who are
they're hard to
interested
debug.
yeah, for folks who are interested in learning more, we can attach a link to a paper where I think the term was coined from some researchers at Microsoft Research to the show notes.
Oh, excellent.
Nice.
This area right here, as you're describing it, I'm kind of visualizing it as kind of a zone. And it feels like that zone, you mentioned the word adaptive capacity too. That's kind of a similar zone where the boundaries of the system are being pushed. Now they haven't been pushed all the way. So we haven't hit a point where systems start to decompensate and they're not able to attend to whatever's going on. Now, in this same space is where I think that I see a lot of confusion for responders. And it makes me think of the question, how much ignoring is going on here? In your experience, I'll ask you first, Joanna. In your experience, have you come across instances where this extremely ambiguous area of, is it a gray failure, or is it encroaching on a real failure, a real outage, or some boundaries getting pushed? Have you experienced responders or people on call that will kind of hold back, and maybe they've detected a problem, but they're still not sure, and maybe they let the problem go too long? You know, another way that to state this is deciding on what a severity is. It's kind of the same thing, I think. What do you think, Joanna? Have you encountered this?
Yeah, and actually it ties into quite nicely into something that both Kurt and Laura hinted at, which is given, you know, the way the modern stacks are built, they're often resilient against some of the most common things you can think of, right? CPU usage, right? I think Kurt mentioned, like, why would you want to alert on it if it's something that the system can, self recover from? Because very often the way the systems are built, like they're self-healing, right? They could be auto-scaling, right? And I think part of it comes from you trust the system, right? I built the system in a way that it should automatically respond to some of that pressure that builds in, so that when I'm starting to detect problems, right, I expect it to withstand the extended period of time that maybe I need to do investigation in a more patient manner, right? And I use patient maybe not incorrectly, but what I mean is I don't have to wake somebody up. I don't have to treat it as a P0 because I believe that it will last me until I figure out what it is. Or the alternative is it will actually go away on its own, right? I have seen things escalate, and sometimes it works. Right? That's the problem. If 100% of the time it would lead into a catastrophic failure, I think everybody would be like, okay, yes, we have to address it now. But the challenge is trying to figure out in which scenarios it will hold and in which scenarios it will not. And I've seen responders obviously incorrectly assume that what would happen next. And sometimes it will work, sometimes it doesn't. If it doesn't, we end up with the catastrophic failure. And sometimes it's nothing regular, but sometimes it's just a bad time of the month, and we have a job there once a month, and it will just be that last domino that the system just can't take, and it will all start collapsing. So yeah, it has happened, and I've absolutely seen that.
What about you, Laura? Is this situation familiar to you, where kind of people will hold back and not jump in immediately?
I think it depends on the organization and the culture, and sort of what people's expectations and experiences. I think I've seen it both ways. I mean, I've seen cultures where people have an expectation that the system will be robust and this glitch will pass. And I've seen cultures where people assume that if you get an alert, the whole place is about to burn down. So I think a lot of it depends on people's experience of what they've seen and what they've sort of lived through, if that makes sense.
How many battle scars they have.
Yes.
Yeah. That makes me think about resilience and how we were just talking about how things get masked by other problems and how things get masked by robustness. And I'm also thinking that problems can get masked by resilience itself. And the way I'm thinking about this, and maybe you all have some of these experts in your own organization, they're the people who always have one eye on the on-call channel. They are kind of always paying attention to the pager, whether they're on call or not. When they see incidents happen, they have this draw to join the incident, whether or not they've been escalated to, whether or not they're on call, whether or not they're even an SRE. They just get drawn into it. And then human resilience fixes the problem instead of allowing problem detection to happen. Am I making sense? I've seen this happen. I've seen this happen personally in a couple of organizations. Sometimes we characterize this as hero worship and heroing, if I can call it a noun, heroing, or is that a verb?
Heroism, perhaps.
Yeah, heroism. There you go. Thank you. I don't know. What do you think about this? Is this common in a lot of orgs? Is this? I think that these people are also the same people that get burnt out. Let me add that at the end. So what do you think, Laura?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. I think you'll get that in certain cases where you maybe have you have a small percentage of people who've been around for a while, and then you've got a lot of people who have come in much more recently, and you're kind of in that quasi handover situation maybe. So I think sometimes it comes down to a lack of confidence in the hero person, in the rest of the team being able to deal with the problem. I've heard Nora Jones from Jelly call this this phenomenon the island of knowledge, where that you've got one person who's got so much more context and knowledge about the system, and they swoop in and they fix things. And you call this resilience, and I guess in some ways it's good for the system. You're probably going to have more SLO adherence if you've got somebody in here swooping in all the time that there's an inkling of problems. But the other side of that is, if you have that person, they're not necessarily letting the other members of the team actually, acquire that knowledge that they have. So I think you really have to think about that kind of scenario and whether it's good in the long term. I mean, in some ways, it's kind of setting up for a form of organizational brittleness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, organizational brittleness. That's a good word for that. How do we help these people? Do we help teach them how to mentor so that they're mentoring other people instead of jumping in? Is there a way to help these people who do this?
I think that's the best approach. Yeah, lock them out of the system. That's one approach, but I do think that coaching them in the area of mentoring and training is probably a more positive approach than locking them out.
I would say instead of locking them out of the system, send them on vacation and see what happens. Right, because that's like they get to rest and not burn out, but also it gives the rest of the organization the opportunity to first be able to solve the problems on their own, and also learn what gaps in the tribal knowledge are there, right? So that later you can implement, like you said, right, cross-training, mentoring, things like that.
Yeah,
I've heard that referred to as chaosing your people. Basically, instead of turning the system off, you send away the island of knowledge and find out what happens.
I've seen this.
Just like what
Go ahead,
banks
Laura.
do this. I mean, banks send people away on vacation to make sure that they're not committing fraud. And I guess it's sort of a similar idea. Make sure that nobody is fraudulently propping the system up with their own personal heroism.
Oh, I didn't know that. I didn't know that about banks.
I didn't either.
Yes, it's very, very hard to perpetuate a long-term fraud if you're made to actually disconnect for a week every quarter.
Huh.
Oh, interesting. That's today I learned. That's really cool. We're on this topic of resilience, and resilience is people, and we know that the system cannot be held in the mind of just one person. So are there instances where problem detection is actually greatly enhanced when more than one person join in, or more than one resource come together? In other words, how or is it possible for us to adapt when we don't have problem detection in place? Maybe that's another way to answer this question, but around this notion of resilience and the solo hero. First of all, is this a thing that multiple people are better at detecting problems than a single person? And if it is, how can we encourage that?
I would say yes, it definitely is a thing. It may not be common, but it is a thing that teams can be more effective. And this has been shown in medical scenarios, for example, or actually in aviation, with the principles around cockpit resource management, or CRM, that were developed to that the aggregate intelligence in the crew there is greater under the right circumstances than any individual. And it's a form of collective mindfulness, is another term that's used for it. That a group, as you say, can have a more complete picture and sense of the system than any one individual.
I think
That's
also
an interesting. Oh, sorry, please.
Yeah, no worries. I think also because a lot of systems these days are microsystems, right? So you don't often see a failure within one part of the system. Usually it's multiples, or maybe you don't know where the problem is, but you don't have a single person that's expert in all areas, right? You need a team comprised of experts in multiple different pieces of the system, because each of them knows the different part of the system, right? I also have a funny example from our own backyard where we have integration with third parties that only send error messages in their local language, and those are outside of the US. So out of necessity, if we have failures at those integration points, like you sometimes need a person that actually understands the language, and I don't mean Java, I mean actual spoken human language, because their API does not speak English, to be paired up with somebody that knows our system, so that they can work together on those.
Go ahead, Laura.
I've seen that scenario too, where you need to have somebody who's a Portuguese speaker or a Chinese speaker to be able to interact with third parties. Over to you, Laura.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think the comparison to the airline crew resource management was actually very interesting, that Kurt made, because, you know, as you say, people are going to take, you know, I mean, people are different. Everyone has a different set of experience, a different mindset, and they'll know different things. I mean, any set of people will have like a set of overlapping kind of mental models of the system, some of which may be more complete and up to date than others, and also people just think in different ways. So I think everyone here is probably familiar with the Swiss cheese model of safety, where you know, an accident happens when you've got multiple layers of cheese or safety that are supposed to stop you from having accidents or incidents, and occasionally the holes in the Swiss cheese line up and you get the incident, right? But there's a sort of a Swiss cheese of troubleshooting as well, right? You know, everyone has, you know, troubleshooting is hard, and not everyone is going to be able to get to the bottom of every problem quickly or effectively. But if you like pile up more slices of cheese, which are people doing troubleshooting, you're more likely to find it, I think. As long as you've got that atmosphere of psychological safety where people are able to bring up ideas and not have them shot down, you know.
Oh, I'm really glad that you brought that up. First of all, I was thinking Swiss cheese model earlier, but because a lot of what we're talking about is very Swiss cheese model-y. But psychological safety is extremely important, I think, in this topic, especially in the sense of taking more than one person to detect the problem. The way that I like to think about it is building reciprocity among the people on the team. That's something that we do weekly in our weekly practice to practice session that I mentioned earlier at the top. And what I see that do, this kind of weekly iterative practice of working together, is that when people get into an incident, that uneasiness of paging people in the middle of the night or escalating to someone who may not even be on call, like that uneasiness starts to disappear. Like you feel okay waking up, Matt, because, you know, we've been working together weekly and we know each other and we've built this reciprocity between each other and we want to help each other out, and Matt would do the same thing with me. And I think that's a really important part of what you're describing, Laura, the kind of psychological safety, feeling like you're in a safe space, even if it's in the incident channel. You know, we talk about being blameless in incidents, and this is an example of it, is we're not here to talk about blame. In fact, we're not even here to find causes. Let me ask this question. What are we here for when we detect a problem? What is the first thing, Joanna, that your team does or that you do when a problem is detected? What's the very first thing?
Oh, figure out the scale of the problem.
Figure out the scale. Okay.
Yeah.
Laura, what about you? What's the very first thing?
I guess try and figure out if it's having an impact.
Impact and scale. Kurt? What do you think?
I also would think in terms of impact, and impact scale. I think those are largely interchangeable. It's like, does this matter? And how much does it matter?
Right. So we've accepted, okay, we know it's a problem. Now I need to see how bad of a problem it is. Or like Joanna, what you were describing, oh, it's a problem, but we failed over to this other system that can take the traffic for another 2 hours while we try to figure this out. Stuff like that. Yeah.
I think this circles back to your earlier question about whether people ignore problems.
Yeah.
I think some of that is, it depends on how safe it is to declare a problem. I mean, if you think about the Toyota production system and the concept of the end-on cord, where anybody could stop the line if they detected a bolt was not installed correctly or something, and that was recognized and celebrated and looked at as an opportunity for learning. Similarly, if you or your systems or whatever detect some sort of a problem and it's safe for you to raise your hand, pull the cord, whatever it is, and say, hey, there's a problem over here. I don't know how important it is, but there's a problem over here. Then people will tend to do that if it's safe to do it. If they get criticized, if they get browbeaten, if they, oh, Matt's just always causing problems. He cries wolf all the time or whatever. Then people, yes, will tend to ignore them or suppress them. I mean, I think about some of the write-ups around Deepwater Horizon, for example, that there were some early indications, or it comes up in this like accident zero or incident zero concept of we can't afford to declare an accident, so we're going to hide the fact that there was an accident because it'll mess up our safety record, kind of a thing.
Right. The whole 0 days since we've had an accident thing. Ironically, Deepwater Horizon had a celebration around right before the accident of 0 days since an incident type of thing. Pretty ironic.
Wow. This exchange is making me think of something, actually. And I think we started off this conversation about talking about when is a problem versus when is something maybe an expected mode of operation of a system. So I've spent a bit of my career around networks, and if you have so modern data centers, they're built with this thing called a clos network, and the way this works is you've got all these redundant paths, and based on what's called the 5 tuple, which is your source and destination IP and port and the protocol, the packets in your TCP connection are supposed to get hashed onto one of these links. And if a link goes down, there's a couple of seconds while the networking gear figures it out, and then you'll get hashed onto another link. What's actually supposed to happen here is your application says, okay, my connection's gone bad. You create another one and you get hashed onto another link. So one situation I saw was the network provider was, would occasionally have one of these things, and the customer would say, "Oh my God, we're having huge problems from this sort of minor network issue," and the customer thought it was a problem, and the network provider said, "Well, this is just business as usual." So where was the problem? I mean, yes, the network was having expected failures, but why was it impacting this customer so badly? And the answer turned out to be related to a particular piece of VPN software that the customer was using that always used the same source port, which is causing the subsequent connections to hash onto the same link again. So, where's the problem here, right? Was the problem in that software, which was operating the way that it was intended to operate? Or was the problem in the network that was also operating the way it was intended to operate? It was the kind of the conjunction of those two things. So sometimes the problem detection is really complicated by the fact that some problems are not really in one system or another, they're in the interaction of two kinds of systems. And those are some problems that can take a weirdly long time to figure out, because where is the problem? It's the interaction, right? And of course, one system or the other has to be modified to sort of deal with that, but it just
vendors, that connection of vendors. I've been in this situation too. When you're troubleshooting network problems, wide area network problems, you can have 5 vendors in a wide area network problem. And I've been in this case where, well, 3 vendors are getting along and we can talk together and everyone's okay, but we had to get someone on the router in this 4th vendor and they're not cooperating. So we have to kind of assume things. It can be very difficult. We're coming up at the end of our session here. Are there any last words for our viewers in the realm of problem detection? Is there any kind of advice that we can give people? We've given a lot already, but just leaving people with some last words. Joanna, what do you think? Do you have any
Oh my God.
advice?
I don't know if it's advice, but I think it's going to be to accept reality, right? There's no system that is so perfect that it will never have problems, right? I think that's what we spent the last 45 minutes talking about. There will always be something, whether it and things will happen, right? They might be smaller scale problems, they might be bigger scale problems, but they will inevitably happen. Right, so being aware of that and working with that mindset, I think it will help a lot. And what Lauren talked about, psychological safety, super important. I cannot stress that enough. I've seen people coming from organizations with and without that, and there's a massive difference in how they approach war room situations, right? Because that's usually a huge difference in collaboration style. So super important as well.
Agreed. Laura, how about you?
I think my last word is going to be about having some slack in the system, because problem detection, it's something that can be quite time consuming. I think organizations that do have some time set aside to sort of investigate anomalies and weird things that crop up, I think it creates space for people to learn about their systems, and sometimes it creates the opportunity to solve a problem before it becomes a crisis. So I think, to me, I think the big lesson is don't overschedule your teams.
That's great advice.
Yes.
Kurt, any last words?
I wanted to circle back to something that Laura sort of alluded to with her reference of the Swiss cheese model for people. And that I think that the diversity of people that you can bring to bear within an incident is important. And this is where diverse teams, backgrounds, thought patterns, experiences, genders, whatever, that all that diversity can be used and can really help in problem detection, as well as the response that follows once you've detected it.
So if I could sum this all up in one word, I think what we're all saying here is that it's the humans. The humans are the key to what's difficult with problem detection. I want to thank our guests, Laura and Joanna, for being on this session. This was a really awesome conversation. I hope that you, the viewer, got something out of it and you'll go back and feel a lot more safe and courageous to tackle those problems. Thanks again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.